Hello, everyone. For years now, we've been told that some ideas are too dangerous to question, that skepticism itself is harm, and that due process has to take a backseat to moral urgency. But what happens when movements built to protect equality start producing unintended consequences? When doubt becomes betrayal, and when evidence only becomes optional? Today's guest has spent decades living inside that tension. She grew up in the Soviet Union under a system where ideology trumped truth, then emigrated to the United States, where she became one of the most persistent critics of dogma. Not as an observer from the outside, but from within the debates over such issues as feminism, free speech, and justice itself. At times, she's been called a feminist, an anti feminist, a contrarian, and a heretic, and very often, all at the same time. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Cathy Young to the Big Questions. Cathy, how are you today?
I am good, thank you very much. Yeah, I did want to correct you that you said that I had lived decades inside the Soviet system. It was actually really only 1.5 decade, more or less. My
I
family had
apologize.
left the Soviet Union in 1980 when I had just turned 17.
When you
Like
right, right.
literally 10 days after my 17th birthday, we left.
You
So,
left. So
yeah.
maybe you can forgive me my creative excess
No,
in
no, that's
describing.
fine, yeah.
No, but
But,
I
I've
appreciate that.
always
Yeah.
said that I actually kind of left at a perfect time because on the one hand, I had enough experience to kind of understand that system from within.
Mm.
I was a kind of baby dissident, I grew up with parents who were very skeptical of the system, and one of my childhood memories is my mom telling me that I should never repeat to anyone at school, what we talk about at home because,
Right.
otherwise daddy could go to jail. For some reason, it was always daddy, not mommy, but because I guess he was a little more kind of outspoken. But yeah,
Right.
so yeah, I had the experience of that system, and I had the experience of, let's say, my family listening to clandestine radio broadcasts
Mm.
from Radio Europe, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Liberty, Radio Free
Radio Free
Europe,
Europe.
and the
Yeah.
Voice of America. So, I had that experience of exposure to, forbidden materials, so to speak.
Yeah, and
And
and and and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I always find it fascinating when we have a guest on that has had firsthand experience uh, in a lot of in the different ideologies that we find competing, and for a lot of folks in America, especially people who were born here and whose parents perhaps have been here for a couple of generations, that they kind of lose touch of the American ideal in a way that uh, immigrants, children of immigrants, e- e- experience it and understand what we consider take for granted here. And I love hearing those stories. I find it very similar to my own. I was born here, but I'm a first generation American. My father
oh,
came here. He left just as the communists were taking over parts of Greece and
oh
the
yeah,
island that
yeah,
he was from. So he was able
yeah.
to get out, and I always tell people, you have some Americans here who give lip service to being anti-communist, but I can remember my father sitting me on his knee when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and he said, "Now remember, we don't like communists." And when in my own infantile way, I would say, "Why is that, Dad?" He would say, "Because back on the island, they were the only ones who were allowed to have guns."
Oh,
And
that's
it,
interesting. Wow,
right, and that
that is
hits you in a
fascinating.
right that hits you in a way that you don't typically experience here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I
So
wanted
that's kinda like the First and the Second Amendment all kinda rolled
all
up into
rolled
one,
up into
right?
one, right? Yeah. So I wanted to
Yeah,
ask you, particularly because I did read in your bio, you did come over in 1980. You were a teenager essentially at the time, as you
yeah.
mentioned, 17. And from my own experience in the late 80s, and I think it may tie into your experience, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. When I started on Wall Street, we had an influx of Russian Jewish uh, uh, immigrants, asylum seekers,
Oh, yeah.
and they formed like some of the most exciting back then derivatives writers and options writers that we had
Oh,
at our
interesting.
firm because somebody at the bank figured out that Russian uh, chess masters and above, so masters, whatever the rankings are, but when you reach the
Right.
level of master, that they had some innate ability to visualize complicated
Ah,
financial
interesting.
instruments, right? So even though
Interesting.
they barely spoke English, some of them had no
Oh,
banking experience. This bank had the foresight to say, there's this wave of
oh,
people looking for a better life, and they have this particular talent.
right,
And
right.
and I remember their floor manager being someone who was very fluent in Russian. He himself was an immigrant who had been here for a couple of years, and to communicate with that particular group, you had to speak through this interpreter, essentially, unless you
Ah,
yourself spoke
interesting.
Russian. So, from your perspective, also being a Russian Jew, did you leave because of religious persecution, political ideology, some combination of how did your family, I assume your whole family came over, correct me if
Yeah,
I'm wrong.
yeah, it was at the time, it was my, parents and my grandmother. I mean, religious persecution per se, I mean, my family was never religious, so, that was not an issue for us, although, there was still, just the knowledge
Mm,
that certain things are essentially forbidden. Um, and, at the time, it wasn't just for Jews, any manifestation of religious belief
right.
kind of marked you as suspect. My mother had an experience because my mother was a piano teacher who worked in one of Russia's kind of more prestigious professional music schools. And, she taught students one on one. So she kind of had a personal relationship with a lot of them.
Mm,
And at one point, she got a call from the mother of one of her students who said, "Oh my god, you've gotta help me because we have a serious problem. Natasha has become religious and she's wearing a
oh,
cross, and I'm just really worried that if somebody finds out about this, she's not going to get into any college. You really need to talk to her about it, and,
wow.
tell her to be at least discreet about it." And my mom kind of felt really bad because on the one hand, on what grounds would she tell this,
Right.
17-year-old girl to, not espouse or, be discreet about her religious beliefs. But on the other hand, the mom had real concerns because at the time it really was the situation where one thing that I can tell you was that on Easter, they would actually send, the authorities would actually send sort of young Communist League activists to
Mm,
stand outside churches and take the names of, any fellow student that they saw who might be going in. So
wow.
they were spying on people. They would also, because a lot of people in the Russian tradition, in the Russian Orthodox tradition, there is a tradition of going to on Easter, going to your loved ones' graves, and the people bring sort of well, I don't know if gifts is the appropriate word, but like there's a certain type of Easter food that you like put down
Right.
on the
I got you.
grave of the person. You probably know this, right? Because you're from
I,
because
I'm yeah. My family's Greek Orthodox, so I'm sure there's a
yeah,
relationship there.
there's I'm
Yeah.
sure there's a related thing. Anyway, so yeah, so they would also send these young activists to stand at the gate of cemeteries again, watching for anyone they knew from school who might be going to the cemetery to do the sort of Easter rite. So
Wow.
yeah, and in terms of Jewish religious practice, in a way, it was a little more restrictive because there was only one synagogue in all of Moscow, and there was definitely a sense that if you went to the synagogue, you were kind of unnoticed. So
Yeah.
yeah, so there was that. I think mainly, my family was interested in emigrating, because of political repression, because,
Mm,
it really was a country where, you couldn't openly criticize the government. There were certain books that you could read only in secret. My father brought home these underground editions of Solzhenitsyn
Mm.
that he could only that were kind of passing from hand to hand, so he would only get to keep it for a week and then had to give it back. There were other books by the emigre writers that again were some of them were kind of self-published in typescript. Some of them were published abroad and were kind of secretly circulated. And it was
Like an
dangerous stuff. Like you,
like an underground library,
yeah,
basically.
basically.
Yeah.
And, and again, like you knew that you could get in serious trouble for this. And I'll tell you a kind of darkly funny story about my dad, who actually worked for, he was a sound engineer and he worked at the time for Soviet radio as a sound
Wow.
engineer. It was sort of radio slash sound recording. And they did, by the way, like they repeatedly pressured him to join the Communist Party, and he always refused.
Mm.
And he couldn't say, of course, and this is the other thing, like he couldn't possibly say that he didn't want to join the Communist Party because he didn't support the ideology. So he would make up all these reasons, like this, if you remember the Communist Party, you had to go to all these meetings, and he
Right.
would be like, "No, I'm a really busy person." And then he had kind of hilarious conversation at one point with a woman who was pushing him to join the party, and she would be like, "This will take you a lot further in your career, and you can get a promotion." And finally, to sort of get her off his back, he said, "Well, I have like all these bad personal habits that are not compatible with, the lofty morals of a member of the Communist Party." Like, and he actually made up something about, because this was not my dad at all, but like he
Right.
made up something about, "Oh, I'm actually a womanizer and I cheat on my wife." She was like, "Wow, maybe you should try to stop."
And
And,
Kathy,
anyway, but so yeah,
yeah.
but he also had a reputation of, saying these, like, anti-communist things,
Okay.
especially when, because he didn't, like, seriously drink, but sometimes he and his friends would go out, and he would
Right.
drink, and then he would start saying things that were, really kind of, heretical, and, there were people apparently, as he later found out, who actually believed that he was a KGB provocateur
Mm.
because they figured that, only a provocateur could be so fearless and criticize the Soviet regime. So that's the sort of society that my family wanted to get away from. So
Yeah, and it's interesting because as I hear you relate these anecdotes, it's fascinating because if you grew up, say if you're a Gen Xer, say you're part of my
right.
generation, or perhaps say the Gen, was it what came after Gen X, the Millennials? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's
Uh,
millennials and then Gen Z, I guess.
right, but let's say
Oh,
those folks that still grew up and can remember the Berlin Wall falling,
oh yeah.
the Iron Curtain collapsing. Your anecdotes sort of paint a picture similar to what we're experiencing now, politically in the US. Maybe not to
Well,
the
not
extreme,
quite. I mean,
not to that
yeah.
extreme, but
Mm,
in the sense that, picture me being your counterpart in the US. Like I said,
right,
we're basically the same age. My impression of the Soviet Union back then would have been, yeah, people in the Soviet Union have the right to vote. They can vote for the communists or the communists.
right. Yeah,
Yeah, any negative expressions towards the government are brutally put down. People thrown to the gulags for any defiance whatsoever. Uh, and what you just described, while certainly not an open society,
right,
at the same time, like, to hear that your father openly may have mocked, the Communist Party, his refusal to officially join, even if it was in name only,
right.
um, and yet, you're not telling me, the secret police, the Stasi came and threw him in prison one day or took him away to the gulag. Was that a present fear? Uh,
Well, as
I
my
mean,
mom, and actually one reason that my family, because my mom at one point, like when they started opening the gates for some immigration, my mom initially didn't want to leave because she worked for this music school where she had a
mhm,
really good job and she had very talented students. And she wasn't sure that she would find anything equivalent in the US, which, by the way, she actually ended up finding. She had a very she's retired now, but she had a
mhm,
very good career here. And finally, one reason that she did feel that it was really best to emigrate was that she really was concerned that with my dad sometimes being as outspoken as he was, he might
Mm,
end up in prison. The thing is, the repression kind of went in phases. Um, because obviously, well, the kind of the apex was the Stalin era, which
right.
my parents grew up in. And, when my mom was a child, there were people in their building who disappeared
Mm,
and, and at the time, and that was sort of the thing that's interesting. You didn't even really need to be a dissident because the secret police, the NKVD, had this quota of people they needed to arrest. So sometimes they would just, like,
mm,
arrest people for completely made up reasons like and there were like a lot of families who lived through the Stalin years had these stories of repression. My mom had a colleague at the music school whose father ended up in the gulag because uh on the first day of, the Russo-German War, when,
mm,
well, not on the first day even, because Stalin, kind of went quiet for a couple of weeks because he was completely unprepared for the war, and he kind of panicked. But eventually, he went on the radio, and he made a radio address, and, at the time, a lot of, Soviets lived in communal apartments, as you've probably
right,
heard,
right,
right? Where, you had a room and then, there were maybe like 3 or 4 other families. So, and oftentimes they only had one radio for everybody, so you would listen to the radio, and people would gather in the kitchen,
right.
which was the communal space to listen to the radio. So there they were listening to the radio, and this, my mom's coworker's dad says, "Well, my goodness, Stalin sounds really depressed." And then, of
Mm,
course, somebody reports him for, undermining morale, and
yeah,
off he goes to prison, and I think he spent 10 years in prison.
wow.
Um,
Well,
there were other
didn't
cases like that, so yeah, people just so that was the Stalin era. Then
wasn't it Beria that famously said, "Show me a man and I'll show you his crime"?
oh, yeah, I
It
think
was
so.
just
It may
very out
be
open. Yeah,
apocryphal, but that was
yeah,
really the
yeah.
that was the, and I mean, I personally heard about those stories from,
Mm,
people that my parents knew, people my grandma knew. A friend of my grandma's, um, her aunt, went to prison because someone reported that on the day some, famous enemy of the people was shot, was executed,
right.
she was heard playing a funeral march on the piano. And, I mean, she could have been playing it for any
R
sort of reasons,
right,
like maybe someone in her family died, or, maybe she
right.
wanted to play those beats. And one of her neighbors reported her for this, supposed tribute to an enemy of the people, and
Wow.
she got arrested. So yeah, lots and lots of stories like that. My father's parents actually went to the Gulag for. I think they were arrested in like 1948, and then Stalin died in 53, and they got out in I think 54 because that's when they
Wow.
started releasing the people. The thing that is interesting is that my dad's parents, unlike like the vast majority of the people who got arrested, they actually had done what they were accused of doing, which is they were part of a group of Jews who were planning to emigrate to what was then Palestine. I think it was before even the
Oh,
formation of Israel, but it was post-war, and they were part of this group that was going to cross the border. I forget where, but
right.
then they were going to get from there to Palestine.
Essentially Zionists,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
for
don't
being
know if it
Zionist.
was ideological or they just wanted
Right.
to get out of the Soviet Union and go someplace else. Anyway, so as often happens, there was a person in the group who was an informer for the secret police and who
Wow.
reported on the rest of them, and they were arrested. And um, my dad was left in a very precarious position because I think he would have been like maybe 12 years old.
Mm,
Um, and he had like the only reason that he didn't end up in an orphanage, because that's commonly where they took, children of
Right.
prisoners, and conditions were really pretty bad. Luckily for him and his younger brother, who I think who would have been like maybe 7 or 8 at the time, they had an older sister who was of age, so
Okay.
she was able to say, "Yeah, I'm taking care of them," and
Right.
because of that, they didn't go to an orphanage. So, but my dad went through some very rough times because, obviously it was like his I can't remember what his sister did at the time, but she was like 19 years old. She couldn't have been making that much money.
Right.
And they, they had a pretty rough situation. And like a lot of their relatives turned their back on them because they were afraid to be in touch with somebody who
Sure.
was whose parents were in prison. Now, like at one point, I think he met, like, walking down the street, he saw like one of his aunts or something, and she just crossed the street and pretended not to see him.
Wow.
So, it was really pretty bad. And then interesting, like even after um his parents were released and kind of officially exonerated because after Stalin died, and when Nikita Khrushchev uh
Came into power. Yeah.
came to power and basically stood up and said, yeah, there were a lot of bad things that happened, and a lot of innocent people were in prison, and a lot of people were formally exonerated, including I think my dad's parents. But even so, like when he graduated from college, he had a lot of trouble finding a job because you had to fill a questionnaire when you applied for a job. And one
Right.
of the questions was, has either of your parents been in prison or, have been convicted?
Right.
And several times, like he would apply for a job and they would be like, yeah, 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 we really like you. And he was a violinist by profession. So he would apply to like an orchestra or a music school or something like that. And and then he would fill out this, and they would be like, yeah, you just have to fill out this questionnaire and give us all your data. And then all of a sudden he would get a call from them going, yeah, we actually, it turns out that we had already hired somebody else for that job. So yeah, it was that kind of thing. Um,
Right.
and so yeah, it was really so the Stalin era was kind of the height of the repression. And even that kind of went in cycles because like there were the great purges in the late 1930s. And then interestingly enough, during the war, things got in some ways, despite the kind of hunt for spies and saboteurs,
Right.
who undermine morale, in some ways things got a little more liberal. Like Stalin allowed churches to reopen. And I think the
Mm.
reason was that he realized that, you know, to be motivated to fight, people had to feel that, something better was waiting for them at the end of the war.
Well, I was
And
going
there
to
was
ask you.
a political war, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you. It's a little as you were recanting, not recanting, recalling some of these stories. What popped in my head was the interesting thing. I mean, interestingly, we as Americans we've heard that the Soviet Union replaced the church with the state. That in some weird way the
Mostly, yeah.
state became the religion. And when you compare it to, say, Putin's Russia now,
Oh, yeah.
we see a very different relationship with the Orthodox Church, right? So they're
Right.
whereas they're very much more tied into each other,
Oh, yeah.
and the sense that Putin has managed to get the Russian Orthodox Church in large part on his side and to espouse his
Oh, yeah.
positions
Yeah.
for their own survival, obviously. But do you
Yeah.
see that as a
Well, I'm
parallel
not
or
sure it's for their own survival because the people at the head of the church, they're these oligarchs basically who have huge amounts of money and wealth and influence, and who I think in many cases are thoroughly cynical. The church, um, interestingly, I think Stalin was trying to like during the war, I think tried to build a somewhat similar relationship with the church
Mm,
where he basically, tried to marshal it in support of his regime.
right.
And he had, like, because at the time, so this would have been like the war, so 1941, we're talking about maybe, less than 20 years after the establishment of the Soviet state. So there were a lot of people around who had grown up in a religious society and who still had those,
Memories.
religious
Yeah, yeah,
habits.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's one reason I think that Stalin decided to do this because he felt that like all of these people for whom their patriotism is kind of associated with religion,
Mm,
they are going to be better fighters, if
right.
this part of their because I think the authorities knew that some people were still kind of clandestinely practicing
Right.
certain religious rites. And there was just a feeling that, again, they'll be more motivated to resist the Germans if they know that they can do this openly. And also, I think in some parts of Russia, because there were places when the Germans initially invaded, there were parts of the Soviet Union where they were kind of welcomed as liberators, and
Mm.
before people figured out, that this is not what, what
Right,
Nazi Germany was about.
right, right.
And part of that, there were places where people kind of, a lot of people collaborated with the German occupation. And part of the way that that the Germans were able to do that was that they reopened the churches, and they were
Mm.
like, well, those Bolshevik Jews, were desecrated your churches, and
Somehow you knew it was always going to come back to blaming the Jews somehow
oh, of course,
along the way. Yeah.
yeah.
One thing, and this is fascinating, but I do want to talk a little bit more about how when you got to the U.S. now, you're coming not, as a teenager, so you're not like a little girl who may have not appreciated a lot of this geopolitical and ideological difference when you got here. Um, and you get here and you kind of okay so you get to the US. Did you land in New York by any chance? Where did you land when you guys got to
JFK. Yeah, yeah.
JFK?
Actually, my family spent about 4 months in Italy, waiting for because that's where we had our interview at the U.S. consulate in Rome, and we had a kind of nice 4 month vacation in Italy because we did have the sponsorship from
sure,
a Jewish organization. So it was
yeah.
kind of nice because it was this. I mean, we didn't have a whole lot of money, but it was like this completely carefree existence. No school, no job. You can just go for the
Nicer.
books in Rome and wander by the
And I was going to say much nicer weather probably than you
Oh
experienced
God, yes,
in
yes,
Russia.
definitely.
So you get to New York or you
So
get to the
yeah,
US, and now you're in the middle of, in essence, the Reagan Revolution as it kicks off when you get here.
just
Um,
before. I mean, we got
just
here
before,
in
literally, right,
July of 1980,
right.
and
So when you get here, though, how does as you're experiencing this in real time, were you aware of what was being set up in terms of the ideological battle now? Even I mean, the Cold War's still on, but it wasn't on like say the 50s and the
right.
60s when Reagan. You still had the Iran hostage
Oh yeah, yeah.
crisis when you got here. So initially, how does that strike you? Does it strike you as sort of I could see why these conservatives are acting in this way? Did you
Oh, I
have
mean,
more of
I
a
was at the time, I was really only just kind of catching up. And I remember that I was just kind of bowled over by the open political discourse. I mean, that was
mm,
just itself, but
right,
aside from, who you supported, was completely new to me. Um, and I didn't really know very much about Reagan. I actually, I mean, I liked Jimmy Carter because, he had criticized Soviet human rights abuses and, he was pretty good
right,
in that, so I remember actually being pretty upset when he lost and I'm like, oh, he was so nice. But, yeah, and I didn't
right,
really, I mean, I don't think I really appreciated many of the domestic issues. I didn't really know
right,
much about things like inflation and, um, anyway, but I mean, I did very quickly kind of learn to like Reagan. I mean, really did appreciate his his kind of tough anti-Soviet stance. And I
Sure.
remember, I'll tell you a funny story. I was this was like right after Reagan made that gave that evil empire speech. This would have
Right.
been in '83. And at the time, my family was already in New Jersey, and I was attending a community college at the time because I didn't have my high school diploma. I kind of had to ease into the U.S.
Right.
educational system, so I went to a community college, and I remember that I was talking to a woman who knew that I was from Russia, and she was like, "Oh, you must have been so upset when Reagan made that comment about, Russia being the evil empire." And no, no, I think that's great. I mean, yeah, I mean, I totally agree, like 100%. And she was really taken aback.
I was going to ask
So,
you though,
oh,
how you felt about those comments,
my
right?
phone is
Because
mute. Sorry.
that's okay,
Yeah.
no
Anyway,
problem.
go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that one of the things as you start to transition, one of the things I remember referring to that group of Russian emigres when I was on Wall Street, without using the actual word, a lot of them express their libertarianism because to them now this was the first time, right? They're in a high paying field, right? A lot of the things that they were denied in the
Oh,
Soviet
yeah.
Union,
Yeah.
now they had access to, and the idea of paying taxes, the idea of someone telling them they couldn't own guns, especially because we were all New Yorkers at that point, right? So
Right.
restrictive gun laws, high taxes. And looking back at the time, I didn't realize it because my own libertarianism was still percolating a little bit formally. Do you find that as you got here, your own thought process, even if you didn't have the word for it, uh, started to like coalesce around a libertarianism, what's it, a conservatarianism, perhaps,
Mm,
where like, okay, you have this lived experience. Now you're
right.
thrown in the middle of this open society and as as a young lady now you're
Right.
also getting an education, you're going at some point, you got past community college, you're in Rutgers, I think.
Yeah.
You're starting to get like these ideas and now you're starting to formalize things. At that point, did you say to yourself, I don't know if it's an Ayn Rand sort of awakening where you go like, hey,
I did
you
have
know,
my Ayn Rand phase. Yes.
yeah, yeah, not necessarily objectivism,
Right. Right.
but that sort of like because look, I don't necessarily buy into her objectivism, but economically, I thought she was spot on, right? Like she could tell you that free markets beat fair or controlled markets, and tariffs are bad. This market should be able to say price should be allowed to vary. Did you find yourself saying like, "Am I becoming a libertarian?" Was it a conscious thought, or was it just you kind of went
No,
where
I
you
think,
saw yourself go?
and I'm not sure about the time frame, but I do remember that at one point I got on the mailing list of the Cato Institute.
Mm,
So, I discovered them fairly early on. And interestingly enough, a few years later, like by 1990, I was actually kind of working for them on a freelance, basis, sort of where I actually in 1990 they did a conference. Yeah, this is of course when the changes were starting in the Soviet
right.
Union, and the Cato did a conference in Moscow in 1990. Gosh, what was it called? I think it was like Transition to Freedom or something.
Mm,
And I actually went with them to Moscow because they needed someone who could kind of do PR work for them over there in Russian and
right.
who would be bilingual. So, and I can't even remember how I first got to know them. It's funny because, yeah, but I think, I mean, my career kind of got kickstarted when, in 1989, I had a book published called Growing Up in Moscow,
Growing
and,
up Moscow, yeah.
that came out of, one of because I wrote when I was at Rutgers, I started writing for the, student newspaper, the Daily Targum, And there were people who thought I was like horribly reactionary because I was, I was, kind of pro Reagan, and I mean, I was not complete. I mean, I was never a social conservative, so I was because of that. My views were kind of eclectic, but like people were shocked because I was so anti-communist,
Right.
stuff like that. So I was kind of a cold warrior. So I was politically incorrect, so to speak.
Mhm.
And then the articles that I was writing for that I was writing a weekly column for the student paper, and I got the attention of an English professor, Bill Westerman, who was kind of one of the campus conservatives, so to speak. And he was putting together an anthology of student writing or something, and he wanted to
Right.
publish my articles, which was, very flattering. And then he asked me if I wanted to give a talk at his son's high school. I think it was part of a civics class because I think he felt that, they were really not getting good exposure to accurate information about the Soviet
Right.
Union.
Right.
Because, at the time there really was this um view in a fairly large portion of the kind of the liberal intelligentsia that, like we have our version of human rights, the Soviet Union has its version of human
Right.
rights, like we emphasize political freedoms, they emphasize social protections and so on, and the right to free housing and medicine. And I think a
Right.
lot of the time people really didn't realize how abysmal the quality of that housing
Right.
and medicine was. And so that was part of what this professor kind of wanted me to talk about. And yeah, so he asked me if I wanted to give a talk at his son's high school, and I did. And then, as I remember this very well, like he was driving me back to the campus, and he said, "Have you thought of writing a book about, about these
Right. Right.
experiences? Because that would make a really great book."
Right.
And he put me in touch with a publisher. It was a division of Houghton Mifflin, and interestingly, like I actually got this book published without an agent, which is very unusual.
Right. Right.
So yeah,
Especially back then. Yeah.
back
Especially back
yeah.
then. Yeah.
So I was I actually got a book deal at the age of I guess I would have been like 25,
25, 20. Yeah. If I'm looking at my notes correctly, you would have been around 26, give or
yeah,
take when
yeah,
your
yeah,
birthday is. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
I started writing this book, and I actually managed to do like I also did this. I got college credit for my writing because I did this as a kind of senior project
Right.
in
Right.
English. So I wrote my book, and I got like 2 semesters worth of credit in English for it with that same professor as my supervisor on this project. So that worked out really well. And this book came out in '89, which was very fortuitous because there was, of course, a lot of interest in what was happening in the Soviet Union.
Right.
And it was funny because on one level, it was also a little dated because I was talking about the 1970s, the Brezhnev years.
Right.
And I had to write like an epilogue in which I was talking about all the changes that were happening now.
Right.
But I think all in all, there really was a fair amount of interest because the Russia was in the news so much. And so yeah, that's really how I got on that trajectory. And I guess again, it's funny because I honestly have no idea at this point. I do not remember how I got into the sites of the Cato Institute. I think it was like, yeah, you know what? I think there was a guy at the Wall Street Journal, which I think yeah, because I think I did a couple of op-eds for them that also came
Okay.
out of my book. Yeah, and then one of the editors, yeah, I think that was it. He introduced me to some Cato people because
Well, you had fans. You had
yeah, I
fans,
had
and
friends.
and
I had
they were
so yeah, and then in 1992, I also started writing for Reason,
right.
where I eventually became a contributing editor. So I was definitely part of that kind of libertarian scene.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I also want to start to transition a little bit um, to your your people viewing you as and for not my term, but some sort of weird feminist
Right.
who like has a weird brand of feminism. Now it's interesting because um, I've had some other ladies come on who have that sort of label to them as well. Elizabeth Nolan Brown and like Pat
Oh
Murdy
yeah,
who
I
come
know.
on,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
one of the things that when I talk to them about their sort of views on feminism and stuff, both of them were very, very quick to point out, like, we're libertarians first. We believe in individual rights.
Yeah.
And to
Yep.
that extent, feminism is just a subset
Oh
that it's a
yeah. Yeah.
particular
No,
type of
that's what
thing.
it was to me. Yeah. No,
Right.
that definitely
Well,
was.
that was the question I wanted to ask you to talk about because I, I, for people who may criticize you, who say, she's not a real something libertarians are always
Right.
familiar with, right? You're not a, and ironically enough, from other libertarians would be, you're not really libertarian. You're not enough of a libertarian. And your
Well,
corollary seems
actually,
to be,
I should add, by the way, just so we're on the same
yeah,
page, you know, I mean, I'm kind of between labels really
sure,
because I mean, I will tell you that I've never been entirely comfortable with like a certain brand of libertarianism that was a kind of very isolationist on foreign policy.
sure.
Like, I'm not a fan of Ron Paul, definitely, because the thing that I find really ironic is that like there's a certain school of libertarian that is so opposed to like the American foreign policy establishment and the what
Right.
they perceive as US imperialism. And when I first started coming across that, it just sounded weird to me because it was really very much like left-wing rhetoric. And I was like, if I wanted to hear people talk about American imperialism, I would just go listen to some communists.
I agree with you. And by the way, I initially, like I always say, I came to libertarianism not through Ron Paul or
Right.
Walter Block or somebody like that. I came to it through Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman
Right,
is
no,
what
I
is
no,
what
no,
is who
I
converted
did
me.
read I remember that in, like, when I was discovering this stuff, I
Yeah.
read Capitalism and Freedom, which I
Mm,
thought was great, and, and I did really admire, Milton Friedman's foreign policy views, so that was very much, like, the page I was
right.
on.
But
Um
when you're on that sort of again when you're sort of like okay and by between labels I understand what you mean because like I understand you saying if there's some sort of weird libertarian checklist and say there's a
Right.
hundred points on that I'm not going to check off all 100 and I grant you that maybe you check off 50 or what 40 or
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah,
but
I mean, I think that there are, debates about, where do you draw the line in certain areas of individual freedom where,
sure
there really are complicated issues. I'll give you another one.
mm,
Um, Institutionalization of the mentally ill, because there is this, and I will tell you that as someone who spent a lot of time in New York in the 1980s, I have my own view of, what happens when you just put a lot of mentally ill people in place.
I'm with you. I'm a Bronx
Yep.
kid through and through. So it's
Yeah. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, and
Yeah.
to that
So, yeah, there
extent,
are debates. I mean,
sure,
there are areas where you kind of wanna say, "Well, how far do we wanna take individual freedom?" Especially
uh,
what in these
sure,
margin cases where you have mentally ill people, you have kids, I mean, do you
right.
'cause there are, as I'm sure you know, there
Mm.
are, like, really doctrinaire libertarians who feel that there shouldn't be like any age of consent. And if you're like
R-
12 years
r-
old and you want to have sex with
yeah,
someone who's old enough to be your dad,
or
that's
to someone who agrees with you. No, it's really funny
yeah.
because the episode preceding this one, I had the pleasure of interviewing David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son,
Oh,
and it's
wow.
very interesting to see how the two you could see the evolution from Milton Friedman's sort of minarchism, let's say, that I adhere to, and his
Right.
son David, who is much more of an anarcho-capitalist.
Oh, really? Oh,
Even though he's also a physicist by
interesting.
training, it's really funny because it was
I've never
interesting to.
heard of them. See, I'm fascinated
Oh,
now.
I would
Yeah,
say, yeah, give him a shot,
I'm gonna
David.
watch that
Yeah,
episode because that
yeah,
sounds really interesting.
and to me, it was like a natural evolution. Now, I wouldn't, in my wildest accusation, say either one of them is not a libertarian or
Right,
either one of them doesn't believe in individual liberty.
right,
But it's sort of that spectrum, right? So, but what's interesting and where you came to a lot of people's attention is in the subject of feminism,
right,
because you were in the weird position again, like Kat Murty sometimes, or like Elizabeth
right,
Nolan
right.
Brown,
I know.
where
Yeah.
other feminists would say those women are not feminists because
Right, right,
they didn't like trumpet and pick up the banner for the Me Too movement. They weren't the
right.
first ones to condemn, say, who's the Supreme Court justice right now? I can't remember his name; it's escaping me. Who was accused of all those harassment things? You know,
Oh,
when
was
he
it
was in
do you
college.
mean Brett, Clarence Thomas, or do you mean Brett Kavanaugh?
Kavanaugh was,
Kavanaugh, right.
and to an earlier decade, you're right, Clarence Thomas as well with not Anita Hill,
Yeah,
and those accusations. Now, it's one thing to say, in my opinion, let's investigate it, let's look into it.
right.
But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you may have been attacked by other feminists for not having a knee jerk reaction to those
Oh, yeah,
accusations.
yeah, no, I totally had big classes with feminists on the whole, like, believe women thing. And again, for me, it's a question of individual rights. I mean, yeah, I think it's great that, we got past the point where, in the late 70s, which would have been like around the time that I came here,
Mm,
it was still acceptable to, question a rape complainant about her sex life and sort of imply that, hey, maybe you
she
did
was asking for it. She
because,
was asking for it, right?
yeah, because you've slept with, like,
Yeah,
10 guys. So, who's to say that you didn't also consent to sleep with this other guy who,
right.
anyway, so yeah, it was, I think there were very real injustices, in the handling of rape cases. I think very few people would disagree with that. But I think, interestingly enough, there were feminists who warned about this, like even in the 70s. There was a woman who wrote, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but there was a female law professor at Columbia, like back in the 70s, at a time when there really weren't that many female law
Right.
professors, who basically said, yeah, there are areas where we really do need to change, rape laws, but we also need to be careful not to, as she put it, sacrifice the rights of the accused on the altar of women's liberation.
Yeah.
And there were areas, like even like the rape shield laws. Yeah, I think, again, it's great that laws were passed that said, you can't, drag out the victim's sexual past in court and, either try to use to discredit her or to just humiliate her so that a lot of women don't come forward because they know
Right.
there will be question about things like, well, are you in the habit of going to bars alone? And, do you sometimes pick up men at the bar and stuff like that? So, it's obviously it's a good thing that, that was curbed by law. But you also started getting these cases, and I have actually written about that issue specifically with the rape shield laws, where, for instance, um, there were cases where a woman's prior history of making false accusations of rape was ruled inadmissible on the grounds that it was part of her sexual past. And this
Mhm.
is where you're getting into an area where, it's clearly um, uh, it's clearly unjust to the accused. There were some really interesting cases. Like there was one case in which a man was accused of rape, and he was claiming that basically the woman got upset with him because, like, they were in bed, doing whatever. And at some point, he mentioned something about her former boyfriend that got her pissed off, and they had this big fight, and
Mm.
he was not allowed to say what the fight was about because, I think he was only allowed to say, like, "Well, I said something that upset her." And he got convicted, and who know I mean, if he had been allowed to, tell his version of the story, who knows if he would have been convicted or not, but, I mean, it just seems ridiculous to
Right.
say that, there was there were several cases like that. I wrote about a case. There was a pretty high-profile case that you may or may not remember in, New York in I guess it was in the late '90s. There was this guy named Oliver Jovanovich who was dubbed the cyber sex fiend, and it was like because the internet was kind of new at the time, and this was a case where
Right.
he met the girl he was a Columbia grad student who met this girl from Barnard in a Columbia chat room. And I think because the internet was so new, there was just a lot of interest and curiosity about like, oh my God,
Sure.
are there these sexual predators, lurching in chat rooms? And what happened was that, he brought her back to his place and he tied her up, that was
Right.
indisputed. And I think like he may have done some things that were like physically painful. And then he said that they had discussed this beforehand and she was interested in S&M.
Right.
And the girl just was adamant about no, no, no. She had never told him anything that would show an interest in S&M. And then he was actually able to, submit emails that they had exchanged where she had mentioned having previously been
Right.
in S&M relationships with a couple of other guys. And initially, like the trial judge said, we're not going to admit that because that pertains to her sexual past. So basically, this girl was able to get on the stand and lie
Right.
because the things that would have rebutted her version of the story were ruled inadmissible. And then the New York State, the appellate court, I always get confused because I think in New York, the state court of appeals is the highest court.
Instead
And
of the
then the
Supreme Court.
Supreme
Yeah.
Court
Yeah.
is the New York State Supreme Court is actually
Right.
below that. So I always get confused about
Yeah.
that. Anyway, so yeah, so the highest court of appeals basically said, no, that is not a fair application of the rape shield law because you cannot exclude things that pertain directly to this woman's communications with the accused,
Right.
um, on the grounds that it also pertains to her sexual past. Uh, and it really kind of blew my mind that the women's groups in New York were upset about this, and they were like, "No, this is a blow to the rights of sexual assault victims." And like, I
Right.
mean, it just seems like basic justice, and you're really not, doing feminism any good if you put it on the side of, limiting the rights of the accused. And, interestingly enough, and I wrote a book, which you may be aware of. I wrote a book that came out in 1999 called Ceasefire.
Mm.
It was the title that I wanted was Beyond the Gender Wars, but like my publisher wanted Ceasefire, and then it had this
Right.
very long mouthful of a subtitle, which was like
Right.
why women and men must join forces to achieve true equality. And like,
Right.
anyway, so yeah, so I
Mm.
actually wrote that in some ways, these attempts to limit the rights of the accused ended up backfiring against women because there was at one point, I don't know, you probably remember this. There was a series of these weird, daycare sexual abuse cases in the late
Yeah.
1980s, early 1990s. It was just this like a witch craze where suddenly there were these, cases popping up where, people were being accused of like doing all these horrible things to kids. And there was like
Right.
devil worship. And
Right.
in a bunch of these cases, the accused were women, and some of them were undermined, by laws that kind of limited what sort of defense they were able to offer, uh, you know, ostensibly in the name of protecting women, female accusers. And there was a woman here in New Jersey. There was a horrendous case, a woman named Margaret Kelly Michaels, who was a daycare worker who was given some sort of, like she was given a 50-year sentence or something. And then people started digging, and you probably remember some of this because it turned
I remember it in hazy terms because I
yes,
do
it
remember
turned
that.
out that the kids were being questioned in this really leading way, like,
Yeah.
the social workers were saying things like, "Come on, don't you wanna, help other kids by telling us what happened to you?"
Well, those
But
cases always, you're to your point, that's one of those you can't have hard and fast rules because especially when it involves children.
oh, of
Y
course, yeah,
you wanna protect them, but at the same time, they are
yeah,
so
yeah,
easily manipulated by adults in either direction where it almost becomes like, you have to take it on a case by case basis. But I was gonna ask you, given your experiences there, and certainly by being attacked, and I use this very loosely, by your own, meaning
right.
other proclaimed feminists. Do you see parallels to what's happening in our society today? In other words, do you see where perhaps laws and government
Mm,
positions that are stated for the protection of a particular class have the
right.
pendulum has now swung to the other side. Let me give you a quick example. For example, the so-called face laws, the anti KKK laws, the intimidation laws that
Mhm,
were initially written to protect African Americans from being intimidated by the Klan
right.
right after their emancipation. Those are now being used in Minnesota to prosecute the Don Lemons
Oh,
and the
yeah, yeah,
so-called
yeah, that is fascinating.
church
Yeah,
protesters.
yeah, yeah.
You do have the
Mhm,
tragic incidents with the two killings again in Minnesota,
right.
uh, Good and Preddy,
Yeah,
where now the narrative is turning around. Right? It's literally not did they commit crimes worthy of the reaction they got
right,
from the
right.
government, but it turns into, and I've said this on Twitter and a lot of people are upset with me. I said this is literally the old the woman who was raped, was
Was
she
she
wearing a
wearing a
mini
shirt?
skirt?
Right, right,
Was she
right.
wearing a short skirt because maybe she was asking for it? It's a tragedy she got raped, but maybe she was asking
Yeah, yeah.
for it.
Yeah, and
Do you
also with
do you see
Freddie, you
Yeah.
get the Second Amendment issue, which has
Oh,
played out in
absolutely.
really interesting ways, and I did a column about that for Newsday, where I write a weekly column, where I mean, in a way, it's kind of interesting that I think the administration and its, propagandists have really kind of stepped into a hornet's nest, I think, when they because generally speaking, the pro Second Amendment crowd really has been part of Trump's base. Really,
Absolutely.
just because the Democrats have been,
Anti
battling.
two-way, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's funny because you literally see, like, some of the same arguments, like, why would you bring a gun to a protest? And then, of course, people, put
Right,
up these pictures of all the, anti-lockdown protesters,
right.
carrying these huge guns. And it's like, really? Maybe like this? And,
Yeah,
and then you have Kyle Rittenhouse and this whole,
sure.
yeah.
Yep.
So there is definitely, but I mean, at this point, I've been in the field for a long time, and the kind of one rule for me and another rule for people who disagree with me. That doesn't surprise me at all because I've seen a lot of that across the board. So you know, political tribalism, unfortunately, is one hell of a drug,
Mhm.
and you see it a lot. And and at this point, I mean, I am at a point politically where I am definitely interested in, people with integrity,
Mm,
basically. And I'm interested in people who are um, who are committed to intellectual pluralism and, honest disagreement. And, in that sense, I am quite willing to, ally myself with someone who has a much broader, much more expansive idea of what the government should do than I do, as long as you're willing to, abide by these, because obviously there are certain constitutional protections that
sure.
you know, do not want to, go beyond. But as long as you stay within, that constitutionalism, I'm not going to get into debates about, is the income tax constitutional or not. I mean, I
Right.
think that's our
Right.
most, and it's funny because, of course, the Trump administration is anything but libertarian in economic issues. I mean, they're
Absolutely
really
not. Yeah.
sort of like, big government socialists in some ways, and they want to have their industrial policies. So, I mean, in a way, I mean, it's kind of depressing because there really isn't anyone um, on the major political scene who is genuinely committed to not even just free markets, but kind of just minimally regulated markets. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to be well. Are we okay? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're okay. Sorry. Yep.
So yeah, like I'm perfectly willing to say, and I think there were libertarians like Hayek, for instance, who said, yeah, like we should have a basic safety net, because it does make sense that in a wealthy society, people will not want to see people who have fallen in hard times for one reason or another, end up in the street. There are people
Right.
who
Well,
have,
it's self-interest, right?
yeah,
Like
of course,
Hayek, Friedman, a lot of these people said, "Look, that's why we're minarch." Milton Friedman, I'm sure to his son's chagrin, once said, "Hey, look, I'm not an anarchist. I'm not
right,
for
right,
getting rid of government entirely. I just
right.
believe in a minimal
Yeah,
government." So
exactly. Yeah.
I think we could all agree that,
Yeah, and
uh,
of course, then you get into debates about, what is minimum and,
right,
well, yeah, and you get into questions like, should cultural institutions get any sort of funding from the government and so on. Yeah, so,
right.
I mean,
There's
you get
yeah,
into those debates on the margins, but I mean, that to me right now is almost like secondary because I do think that we have a big problem with kind of, an across the board tendency to demonize political enemies. And I've
yes,
actually, it's interesting because I can show you, I mean, I don't need to, to show you
mm,
these, but I was writing pieces like for Reason in like 2003, 4, 5, where I was saying that, there is a dangerous drift toward demonizing political enemies and I was pointing to people like, Michael Moore on one side on the left and, Rush Limbaugh on the right, who I
sure,
think did a lot of that, unfortunately.
yeah,
And I think a lot of it was based less on principle than on, again, just pure tribalism. And I think that has gotten much worse, obviously, in the intervening
yeah,
years. And, right now, I mean, I don't insist on having a candidate who's going to be, even remotely close to all of my views. But I mean, it's nice at least to have people with integrity. Like I have a lot of disagreements about a lot of things with Rand Paul, for instance. I mean, I
sure,
don't like his foreign policy ideas. I mean, I think he's been like way too kind of well, I don't wanna say he's Russia friendly because I don't wanna make it sound like
right, right,
Putin's tool or something. But, I mean, I think he does have that kind of knee-jerk skepticism of, a strong American foreign policy that sometimes translates into, being too sympathetic to, regimes that are, kind of on the other side. So yeah, but on the other hand, I really do appreciate Rand Paul's commitment to civil liberties, which I think is very
yeah,
genuine. And I think, he's been able to speak. He's been willing to speak critically about things like tariffs, about things like infringements on freedom of speech, and so on.
right,
That I think is very essential right now, and I don't really care if I agree with Rand Paul 100%. I mean, I
right,
really do appreciate integrity,
yeah,
and he certainly has that. I think, and I think
yeah,
the willingness to criticize your quote unquote tribe is very important. And sadly, there are not a lot of people who are willing to do that. I mean, I think the Democrats really kind of shot themselves on the foot by sticking with Joe Biden when it was,
yes,
very, very obvious that he shouldn't run a second time.
right,
And And, like, I remember, like, even my mom, who doesn't really follow politics that much, was like, "He's running again?"
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
crazy.
leave it to
Yeah.
moms. My mother had the more humanist reaction to Joe Biden was, "Oh, that poor man.
Oh, yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
why are they putting him through this?"
I
I
know,
understand what you
yeah,
mean.
no,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
yeah.
talking to a friend of mine whose dad is he is younger than Joe Biden. I think he's now,
Mm.
like, 74, 75. But she was like, "Oh my god, like, if my dad wanted wanted to take a, incredibly demanding job, I would be like, 'No, dad, don't do this.'" And
Don't
she was
do it.
really appalled, by the way, when I think it was reported that, Hunter and Jill
Mm.
really wanted him to run
We're
again.
pushing him. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and she was like, well, my friend was like, "What are they doing? Like, if this was my dad, I would be like, 'No, no, don't do this.'"
Yeah, I actually care about him. I
Yeah,
don't wanna put
yeah.
him in that
So, yeah, that
situation,
was
right?
crazy. So,
Yeah,
yeah, but the Democrat, but, that's a personal thing, whatever their
yeah.
motives were, the Democrats really, really screwed it up. And I think, and of course, Kamala Harris was not only was she not a great candidate, but she had all this baggage from 2020 of, taking these fairly extreme positions
Sure.
that didn't play very well in 2024. But she was also kind of hobbled by her connection to Joe because, she couldn't really throw him under the bus. And when she was asked, I mean, I remember like one moment when I thought, she is not going to do well. When she was asked, I think it was on The View, she was asked, like, name one thing that you would do differently from Joe Biden. And she gave some sort of answer that was really just verbiage, where it was very obvious that she was trying not to answer the question.
Right, yeah.
Because I mean, I think people often kind of cited her word salad, as evidence that she was stupid, but I don't think that was it. I mean, I don't think Kamala Harris is dumb. I think it's really that she was not allowed to say anything that would, that would draw too clear a line between her
Right,
and Joe Biden.
right,
So she had to kind of fall back on this word salad because there was nothing else she could say, and she
right,
kind of
right,
had to dance around the subject.
right, right.
So that was stupid. And of course, the Republican, I mean, don't get me started on the Republicans because they have been so incredibly spineless with regard to Trump. It's disgusting.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, and
yeah, yeah.
you're right about that. Uh, Kathy, as much as I wanna continue this, I have to start winding down the show because we're running out of time. But before we do that, first of all, thank you very much because I
Thank you.
find you to be a great storyteller, and, that's something that I definitely appreciate. But before we sign off, I wanna ask you, some questions. I call it the silly questions part of the interview. These are 5 questions,
Sure.
rapid fire, just to give us an insight into your personality and character a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, first question. What surprised you the most about America when you first arrived here?
What surprised me the most about America? I think it was how friendly everyone was.
Hmm,
Yeah, because it's kind of fascinating that in America, like and even I think we're a less friendly society today in some ways than we were in 1980. But even so, like it's very customary for people to just kind of casually smile at each other,
hmm,
and and like even say hello. And I'll tell you if you have a second, I will tell you a
sure.
really funny anecdote about being back in the Soviet Union in 1990.
90, yeah.
So I'm in Moscow and I'm visiting one of my relatives, and I'm in the elevator, and this woman who lives in that building comes in, and I just smile at her and say hello, in Russian because that's what you do in America
Right.
when you find yourself in an elevator with a person, you smile and say hi. And she kind of gives me a weird look and is like, "Do I know you?" Like, "Why are you saying hello to me?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I actually have to explain, like, "I'm from America where that's how we do things." And
Right.
then she really gave me a weird look. So, yeah, but that was something that really struck
Okay,
me as wonderful that,
okay.
people were so friendly. That and I think just the open debate. I mean, I remember
Mm,
because this was, of course, during
right.
1980, the campaign was in full swing. And I remember just reading the papers, like, wow, this is amazing. So, yeah. So yeah, that
Okay,
yeah.
good. I was gonna say, you probably felt in Russia the way I feel as a New Yorker when I go to Kansas. Like, why are these people smiling and saying how and asking me how my day is?
Yeah,
Drives me
yeah.
crazy. All right, what's your favorite comfort food?
Oh, my favorite comfort food. My goodness, I hadn't thought of that, but I have several. I love tapioca pudding.
Okay,
You know,
that I have to admit, no one's ever mentioned tapioca pudding,
okay,
but if
I'm gonna be unique and just stop with that. I have
fair
others,
enough.
but
Okay, but tapioca pudding is an interesting one. Okay, if you weren't a writer, what would you be doing today?
if I weren't a writer, what would I be doing today? I seriously considered going into academia. So
Mm,
I might have been an academic, which of course has all sorts of issues with political conformity. But I have kind of guessed what over the course of my career a couple of times, and I really did enjoy that. So I think
but as a
that might
teacher.
have been a good career. Who knows?
Yeah, definitely. Um, what do you feel is more damaging to individual liberty? The openly authoritarian state or the aggressive nanny state?
That is a really great question. I think all in all, and I can see how the aggressive nanny state can be in some ways more insidious because it's outwardly benevolent. But even so, I mean, for all the problems associated with social pressures, um, the the uh, the threat of going to prison if you speak up, I think really is uniquely bad. So
Mm,
in that sense, I think the intimidation is worse. And I mean, if I had to choose between one or the other,
right.
yeah, I am definitely going with the nanny state.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And then the final question: what writer, philosopher, thinker, pick your choice, has influenced you the most?
Oh my goodness, sorry about that. I
That's
had
good.
to
That's
mute my
good.
phone. Yeah, what writer influenced me the most? There have been so many. Um, but I would like if I had to pick one. I would probably this is gonna be unexpected, but I'm gonna pick Voltaire.
Okay,
Uh,
Voltaire's fine.
because, he has this and I do know that he was anti-Semitic, which is unfortunate, but he did live in the 18th century, and all right, we do make some
Right.
allowances for time, but I think he was genuinely committed. I mean, I don't know whether he actually said that line about, "I do not agree with you, but I will defend to the death
Right.
your right to say what you say." But I think that does accurately reflect his commitment to tolerance and he also had this kind of satirical skeptical spirit which
Sure.
is very very congenial to me. So yeah, I would say Voltaire, but there have been many others.
Of course, it's always
Yeah,
hard to narrow it down
yeah.
to one. Voltaire, though, is an excellent answer. All right. Ekaterina Young, as I'm bound now to flex my ability in two languages. Thank you so much for joining me here on the Big Questions. I really appreciate it. Please let everyone know, where can they find your work? Where can they
Oh, well,
look after some of your stuff?
my work, my kind of flagship at the moment is the Bulwark, which
The
is
Bulwark.
a
Yep.
very controversial publication. Um, there are a lot of people who are kind of triggered by the very mention of the Bulwark. They're
Right.
usually pro-Trump people, and I get these comments on Twitter like, "Oh, you're right for the Bulwark." Well, obviously, because it's a kind of Republican, never Trump publication that has drifted
Right.
somewhat more into being aligned with Democrats. So, but I mean, I love it. It's a big tent
Right.
ideologically. It has a lot of great people, and and that is primarily where you find my work. I still write for Reason.
Okay.
And not as often as I would like to, but I also write for Quillette, which I don't know if you're familiar with them,
Yes,
but they're
Quillette.
great,
Yep.
and they're kind of libertarianists. I don't know
Yes.
if you know Claire Lehman, but if you don't, you really should.
Yes, actually, I do. I've
Oh,
read some. I haven't met
great.
her, but
You
yeah,
should get
yeah.
her on the show because she's great.
Put in a good word.
I write for Quillette. I also write for Persuasion, which is another kind of politically eclectic, pro, intellectual pluralism
Mm.
publication. Yeah, oh, and I write for Newsday. Yeah, Newsday, which is
Oh,
a Long Island-based, legacy media paper. That's
yeah.
my link to the print media. I still occasionally write for the Boston Globe, where I was a columnist for 7 years. So yeah, I'm kind of all over the place,
So you're around. You're around.
and I have a couple of book projects coming up.
Okay.
So they're actually related to the French Revolution of all things. So,
All
and
right.
as
Well,
I was telling a friend of mine, you know things are bad when the reign of terror is my intellectual escapism, So,
right.
but that's
Well,
one of the books I'm working. I
excellent.
actually just finished, and I'm kind of editing before I start pitching.
Oh, all
It's
right.
a novel. It's a novel set during the French Revolution.
Wow, fantastic. Well, thank you
So,
so much for
all
joining
right.
me. I really appreciate the conversation. Maybe we'll have you on again. Like I
Thank
said,
you.
I
I would
always,
love it. I mean, I really enjoyed this. So,
oh, thank you so much. And for everyone out there, don't forget to join us next time when we'll have somebody else almost as interesting as Cathy Young here to talk about
thank you. I appreciate it.
certain issues. And certainly subscribe, smash the like button, leave a comment. Cathy, I'm sure, will be happy to answer you if she sees your
Yes,
comments below.
absolutely. And you can
So
also find me on Twitter, by the way. It's Cathy Young 63.
Cathy Young, 63.
CathyYoung, all one word, letters.
I'll
The number is 63.
we'll put it up
You
so
know,
people can see it easily. And once again, thank you for joining us,
thank you for
everybody
having
else.
me. It was wonderful.
It was a pleasure, everyone.
Take
See
care.
you next time. Peace,
Yes,
everyone.
absolutely.